Well, good evening. Welcome to our February deep dive here, looking at Bible translation. So if you're here in person, you can come on and get kind of close by. We got some handouts on the tables there. If you're viewing online, we've tried to put that handout there in the comments section so you can follow along with us, as well as kind of guide through this conversation. And so really this past year when we've been doing these deep dives, the overarching theme I've been focusing on is differences. You've often been comparing differences in terms of religions or groups. So that's kind of a fun way to explore differences. So we're doing that, but with a little variation tonight, which is we're going to talk about different Bible translations and kind of the background for those things and why there are so many of them. Part of that is, as we're part of a series a few weeks back, we talked about Bible engagement and the importance of reading the Bible on our own, not just at church. And one of the things that pops up when we start talking about Bible reading, often people say there's a lot of different translations out there. Which one's the best one? Which one should I use? And we even talked how as a church we use one in particular that we typically have week after week in preaching, and we were shifting which one we were going to use from what's called the ESV to the CSB. So we thought it wasn't maybe the place in the sermon to go into Bible translations and pros and cons and backgrounds, but that'd be a great conversation for a night like this in terms of a deep dive. So that's why we're exploring that. So that'll be the topic we look at tonight. So there's a handout. We'll walk through some big picture elements as well as hopefully some details. And as always, this will be a spot to ask questions, to ponder things. So if you have questions or concerns, to be able to address those this evening. So let me go ahead and open us in prayer, and then we'll come on in. Father God, we give you thanks for this time, and as we now even explore your word and its renditions in English, we ask for your guidance to help us understand some new things, and most of all, that this would help us both be driven more to read your word, to understand, and to give you thanks for the goodness and the glory of your truth that is given to us in our language. And even in this time, we'll think and pray for those at work in the mission fields right now who are seeking to translate the Bible into different languages. May you bless their work, and may you help more people know your truth as they read the truth in their native tongues. So be with us this evening as we discuss, and be with them as they minister in your name. And we ask this all in Christ's name. Amen. So to try to hopefully set the framework and maybe prove that this is a conversation we actually need to have, I want to start off by just thinking about, part of the way I phrase this is, why are there so many different Bible translations? So is that actually true? Are there a lot of different Bible translations? So even before we dig in, I want just to gauge what Bible translations, when we talk about translations or versions of the Bible, what ones are you familiar with? Have you used? Do you know about? So just kind of name some of them, and I'll jot them up here on our flip chart here. So what are some Bible translations you're familiar with? So the New American Standard Bible, NASB, and all these usually have shortened forms, abbreviations. So you have NASB. What other Bible translations do we know? Is there the Holman Christian Standard, Holman Christian Standards, HCSB, NIV, the New International. So always have the NIV. Okay, what other ones? Sorry, what? English Standard Version, ESV, NLT, New Living Translation. I know that's one that you'll see sometimes quoted in services or in students. King James, yeah, we don't want to forget King James. I mean, King James has been dead for a little bit, but his Bible still lasts, so we got to make sure that's out there, yeah. Other translations that you might use, familiar with? Darby, the Darby translation. I can't remember where the abbreviation is of that, if it's just like DAR or not, but we'll make it be that. Or maybe it's DBY, can't remember. So, Darby, so yeah, other. So the Message, there's yeah, we keep on Amplified, AMP. We got the King James. There's also, the sequel, the New King James. That's follow up there. It's one of those that you can keep going and going and going, but just want to say that there are a lot of those ones out there. And even thinking of my own journey, the first Bible I got was something called the Today's English Version, or now it's called the Good News Bible. So that was like the first Bible I had. Then I got an NIV. Then over the years, I was then using NASB when I was first teaching Bible in a church, but then was using NIV, but then used a little bit of ESV. Was doing some reading of the New Living. When I was doing my dissertation studies, a lot of times we was using the New Revised Standard. Still have a King James copy. Worked on a study Bible with that. Worked on a study Bible for the New King James. Like, even my drive, there's a lot of these ones when I taught an FCA camp, they were using this Holman Standard. So there's like, they're all out there and they're used in different ways. And so kind of like, why so many of them? Why, ever wonder, like, why can't there just be one? And that way, when you come to a Bible study, everyone's on the same page, literally. Why are there so many of them? So we'll try to explore that. And the way that I'll work out by, in some ways, starting with the very basics, just to kind of make us think through and then dig through a little bit of some of the history is, ultimately, why are there so many English Bible translations? I mean, there's a couple of practical reasons. First and foremost, and this might be like just reminders, the Bible wasn't written in English. So therefore, there needs to be a translation. That the Bible wasn't written. It was written Old Testament in Hebrew with some Aramaic elements. New Testament's written in Greek. So the Bible's not written in English. And most likely, you don't read ancient Greek or ancient Hebrew. That's why we need translations, is because it wasn't written in English, and you probably don't speak or read these languages. And even if you are a native Greek speaker or a native Hebrew speaker, these are also ancient forms. So imagine picking up Ye Old English. If you look at Old English from a couple thousand years ago, it looks very different in many ways. You can kind of decipher things, but language, even if you speak the language, you might not be able to read the initial language. So really, there's two solutions in light of those factors. That the Bible wasn't in English and you don't read that language, is either you can learn the language, and we could say, everyone, if you want to follow Jesus, you need to learn Greek and Hebrew. That would be one solution. Or the other solution is you translate it. You bring that translation. And this is a spot where things will differ from Christian faith, from a faith like Islam, where they would say that the Quran needs to be read initially in Arabic. There are English translations out there, but that's not necessarily the endorsed way of doing it. So it's actually unique that Christianity is saying, no, we can translate these things. But those are the practical elements, but there are a couple of theological reasons as well. So one of the things that we believe about the Christian faith is we believe the Christian faith that the Bible is for all cultures and all languages. That we don't think that the Christian faith is something that you have to, again, speak Greek or Hebrew, that it transcended that. In fact, within the Bible itself, you have the Bible translating itself. In the New Testament, you have written translations of the Old Testament. So the Bible affirms this translation. So people have been translating the Bible for thousands of years, but we'd say the Bible is for all times and places. So it's not that you conform to that culture. It's that the Bible, the message of the Bible penetrates and changes every culture. So it can be spoken and believed in every language. And that's just kind of an interesting thing to think through. And one of the things that makes Christianity unique is majority of Christians don't speak the initial language that it's written in, because it spreads so much. It's a less common thing. And we'd also say the Bible is for all people. 2 Timothy 3:16 says the Bible is inspired, is breathed out by God, and is useful for teaching, for correcting, for rebuking, for training in righteousness. So what this is saying is the Bible should be read and is useful for everyday life. It's not just a religious document you read in certain ritual settings. It's to connect with life. So that's why we translate it. And so then one of the Confessions of Faith, Westminster Confession of Faith, puts it this way: but because the original tongues are not known to all the people of God, who have a right unto an interest in the Scriptures, basically saying, because everyone that wants to know about the Bible doesn't speak that initial language, and are commanded in the fear of God to read and search them, therefore they are to be translated. And I love this. This is what happens when a document's written in the 1600s. To be translated into the vulgar language of every nation. Now, vulgar means something different in English today, I think, than what vulgar language meant in the 1600s. But it's to be translated into the vulgar, the everyday language of every nation, which they come, the word of God dwelling plentifully in all of them, they may worship him in an acceptable manner, and through patience and comfort of scriptures may have hope. So that's ultimately why we have these translations, because we don't speak it, and we need to hear it. So we should rejoice in that, and that's why the Bible is being translated even to this day. So moving from the need to a translation, to walk through a little bit of a narrative of the Bible being translated throughout history in English, and then we'll go there and walk back to kind of say, how they do the translation to open up some questions. So again, the narratives kind of walk you through a brief history of English Bible translation. And one of the things interesting is really for 1,000 years or so, you don't have a lot of Bible translations into English. Part of that is tied to the nature of language in the first 1,000 years after Christ. You do have some psalms. You also have a lot of like wood carvings. A guy named Caedmon wrote some poems. Others are doing some transmissions. But really the first full-fledged English translation, the first set of them, I'm calling the unauthorized versions. The unauthorized versions, what I mean by that is John Wycliffe and William Tyndale. They translated the Bible into English and lost their lives for it. So not only was it not officially approved, it was unauthorized. It was illegal. And I like to start here by saying, just remember that we have all these plentiful Bible translations. People literally gave their lives so we might read the Bible in English. And so we can take it for granted. But again, John Wycliffe, I won't go into his whole story, but he's doing this in the 1380s. He's Martin Luther before Martin Luther's around. He's like the early English Martin Luther, raising some of the same questions. And one of the things that he does is he says people should read the Bible in their language. So he translates the Bible, all of the Bible, into English. With a quick note, he actually takes the Latin Vulgate, the Bible the Catholic Church used, and translates it. So not from the initial Greek and Hebrew, but he translates a translation. So that is, it's not quite the original, but that's the first real attempt to bring all the Bible over into the English language. Wycliffe, for that, it's like Middle English, so it's like Chaucer, Canterbury Tales, but he is condemned. He has and people, if they read this Bible, they could have their land confiscated. And ultimately, Wycliffe is condemned, and actually over about 35 years after he dies, he's condemned again after his death, and they dig up his bones and they burn his bones because he translated the Bible into English. Just a good reminder of what this meant, the significance of that time. William Tyndale came along a little bit later. After the Reformation, Martin Luther had translated the Bible into German, and Tyndale said, let's do that same thing into English. So he goes from the Greek and the Hebrew. It's printed, but it's now more in closer modern English. He doesn't actually do the whole Old Testament. He sought to get permission. It was denied, so he had to translate the Bible into English from Europe. And what's interesting is, while that Bible was unauthorized, a lot of what would eventually become the authorized version, the King James Version, actually comes from his pen. A lot of what Tyndale translates makes its way into English language. So some of the Bible memorization you might have, or the reading of the Bible in English, might go all the way back to the 1500s. You might be saying the same words and saying it the same way that's been said for almost 500 years. But again, he gets condemned for those things, but it'd be used. And what's interesting is when he's being condemned, he's being killed, he says a prayer, God, open the eyes of the King of England. Because the King of England's the one that's opposing the translation. And within a few years, the King of England now is accepting translations and is actually asking for translations, and within 100 years, making a translation. So his prayer is answered, even as he's saying, God, open the eyes of the King of England, may the Bible be read. So those are the unauthorized versions, the way it starts out. And then what happens next 50 years or so, there's a variety of translations. Just like we have a bunch of translations today, if you lived in 1500s England, there'd be saying a few different translations that were sorting out there. There wasn't one yet. There was a few popping up. I won't dig deep into all these, but you have Miles Coverdale kind of follows Tyndale. That's really the first full translation of the whole Bible, including the Old Testament. And he dedicates it to the king, the same king that was kind of condemning people. And it's not banned. Progress is made. It's accepted. It's no longer unauthorized. It's accepted. Then, but still interesting, the Matthew Bible was not translated by a guy named Matthew. It's translated by a guy named John Rogers, but because it was still dangerous to do so, he went under the name Thomas Matthew. So again, people are dying to translate the Bible or are having to have secret identities, alter egos, in order to allow people to get the Bible translated. That becomes kind of a popular Bible. It's almost a study Bible. There's some notes involved in it. Then later on, you have the Great Bible, and that is kind of a great Bible in terms of that it's placed into all the churches. So now the churches in England are using a Bible in English. But at that point, too, another Bible pops out, the Geneva Bible. And what's interesting, the Geneva Bible is the Bible that kind of comes to America. The Pilgrims, they don't, well, not to jump ahead, the Pilgrims don't bring the King James Bible with them to Plymouth. The Pilgrims bring the Geneva Bible with them to Plymouth Rock. And that Bible is another study Bible. It has the Bible translation, but it has study notes as well. Now, some of those study notes weren't favorable to the king, so he didn't like the Geneva Bible. But that wasn't the Bible used in churches across England. That they had another Bible called the Bishop's Bible, another translation. But this is all within 50 years, all these translations popping out. So you might say, man, there's so many translations there. Can't we just get one that we're all using together? Well, now you're asking the same question kind of that King James starts asking. Once he goes, and some of the backdrop with all that Bible translation is England's kind of going back and forth between Catholicism and Protestantism within the 1500s. So then what happens, there's all these different Bibles out there, including this Geneva Bible that's very popular, but might be anti-king. So King James gets kind of some of the other English leaders together, the Puritans together, and basically gets between 40 and 50 scholars to come together and make one translation that will be kind of authorized, not basically used for church use. And that's where you get the King James Bible of 1611 coming from. So really, he was trying to get rid of the Geneva Bible. He was trying to kind of standardize things. And they decided to bring a Bible translation that would, they said they didn't think this was going to be a new translation. They weren't trying to do this because the other ones were bad. They were trying to make good ones better. They're trying to say, hey, Bible's been being translated. How can we improve upon this? And so they started to make this. There'd be some revisions over time, but their goal was to bring a translation that would have beauty, have majesty, would be a best translation at that time, and that becomes the Bible for many, many ages. And so that's what leads to it. There's actually, it's 1611 when it's published. There are revisions along the way. 1629, a couple other spots. 1768, there's it's all brought together. And so that's what you have now, this King James Bible that becomes the kind of the standard Bible for a couple hundred years. But then in the 19th, 20th century, got a question, Marty? Yeah, so when were the translations being printed as opposed to just being handwritten? That's in that 1500s is also the birth of the printing press. I mean, that's really when the Reformation's coming to age. So the 1500s, these are being printed. Yeah, there's printings going on of all these ones, kind of competing, kind of circulating out, but also knowing printing then wasn't quite what printing is now, where you can mass produce, boom, boom, boom. It was a slow process, and now I'll talk a little bit later on about some of the misprints that would still happen once the Bibles are being printed. Some pretty significant misprints over the years. So these are circulating out there. So.
Oh, I'm on TV. Martin Luther's German translation, did he precede these people, or were these people taking his German translation and translate it into English? Because Martin Luther was coming from the Greek to the German. So did the English people come straight from the Greek, or did they have Martin Luther as their intermediate?
So we are kind of following Tyndale, they're using the Greek and the Hebrew, with a couple of exceptions. That first one, Coverdale, might have used a little bit for some portions he didn't have. But these are all translations from the initial language, from the Greek and the Hebrew. They're all following Luther, but they're following him in terms of time, but also following him in terms of the method they're using. Like they're doing the same thing he did. They're doing for the English what he did for the Germans. These scholars are going straight from the original languages. Yep. But so 1611, you got kind of this King James circling out there, and then eventually what happens is, language changes over a couple hundred years. And also what's going on between the 1600s and the 19th century is you have a plethora of Greek manuscripts of the New Testament especially being discovered. So really the King James translators are only working from a few manuscripts, a small number of them. But in the 1800s, the 19th century, you have many, many manuscripts being found. And some of these manuscripts are kind of showing a few different things. So what happens in the 19th century and early 20th century is you start to have some new translations coming out. So really from 1611 to 1880, there's really no new Bible. There's some that will pop up, but nothing significant. But then you have kind of the floodgates start to open up in the 19th, 20th century. And some of that is they thought the King James was a good translation at the time, but times have changed. Language has changed. Some words then were archaic, as well as some new insights they gathered from the initial languages, or even a better understanding of some of those. So what happens in the 1870s, you start to have these new Bible translations coming in. I have a whole selection of them just listed. I won't give grand details about all of these, but the first, what launches this is what's called the Revised Version. In England in 1881 is the New Testament, 1885 is the whole Bible. That's English, but what's interesting is they had English and American scholars working on this together. And you know how like Americans and English, we got some different ideas at times about how do you speak English, how you write English. You know, there's some elements. Well, this is kind of the Revised Version, it's really the English version. And then what happened was about 20 years later, they let the American scholars kind of publish a slightly different version more of their insight. So you have some differences between the American Standard Version, which I remember growing up, I was like, the New American Standard Bible, what was the original American Standard Bible? Like, why was this new? Well, the initial Standard Bible was made in 1901. And as an example, our Father, which art in heaven or who art in heaven? Ever hear that difference in the Lord's Prayer? Well, in England, you would say which. In America, usually would say who. So that was something. So in the Revised Version, would use this English, whereas in the American, they would say who. So it's small differences there. But neither of these versions really kind of disenthroned, for lack of a better term, the King James Version. The King James Version is still kind of winning out at this point. And really, there's a ways before other translations start to come. But then once you get to the 1950s, that's where all these translations start coming to bear. So you have the Revised Version and the American Standard Version. 1946, you have what's called the Revised Standard Version. And that comes out, it's a national council of churches, comes out, and it's a variety of denominations. They start adding paragraphs. So the King James and even the American Standard Version, every verse is its own line, typically. They're not in paragraphs, because they're like each verse. Well, this radical thing, they put them into paragraphs. Now, again, those paragraphs aren't in the original. They're editorial decisions, but they start doing things like that. They start modernizing the language. But at this point, they're still using thous and still using these. That's still in the 50s, they're using this. The Revised Standard Version had a significant backlash. So there are some places where people thought they were changing the text, where there was what they could say liberalizing going on. So Isaiah 7, for the virgin will be with child. The Revised Standard says, but the young woman shall be with child. And that's in part tied to, there is a dispute about what the Greek means, but so people are saying they're changing the Bible, or there was a few other spots where they thought there's this kind of liberal agenda. So a lot of Bible-believing Christians want to read the Bible, but they didn't trust that. They said, we don't want to use that. We think that this is a bad translation. And so there's lots of backlash. There's even some things like, it says God gave his only son instead of his only begotten son. Or are they saying Jesus wasn't begotten? Or is there different elements? I think a lot of these things were them looking at some different elements, but that then sparks some, you would call evangelical or conservative translations. And that's where we get the New American Standard, the initial one in 1971. So in the 1960s, they started doing that. What's called today's English version. That's the Good News Bible. That was done by a linguist, and he did something different. He said, instead of just trying to do word for word, let's try to convey the ideas, because that's how you try to translate things. You convey the ideas. So he starts giving a little different, so it's not quite as tied word to word, but thought for thought. And that was a radical new translation in one spot. And they called it initially Good News for the Modern Man, using modern English, but bringing the good news. So you have this starts out, and all these, what's interesting is it's published, and you see I have revisions. Almost all of them have revisions the first few years. They publish and they keep on revising small revisions. You have the Living Bible. I have a copy of my Living Bible that I have at home is my grandpa's Living Bible. That was what he would read from, and had underlined things. And that came out in the 1960s and 1970s. That is a man, Ken Taylor. he used the American Standard Version, but then he tried to paraphrase it. It's kind of like, you read something and you try to put it in your own words. That's what he's doing. It's not really a translation, but he was taking that old text and trying to help people get a fresh reading. And he actually started a new publishing house called Tyndale House up in Carroll Stream, Illinois, to publish that. And so you have this Living Bible emerge. And then eventually the Catholic scholars get in on this too. So in 1970, you have the New American Bible, which is really, in some ways, one of the first Catholic Bibles published in English from the Greek and Hebrew. Part of what happens in the 1940s, the Pope said you could translate the Bible into English, and Vatican II encouraged people to read the Bible. So you have the New American Bible is the NAB, that's a Catholic Bible, but they have one. 1973, the New International Version comes out. It was about 1950s is when people started saying, hey, the King James is good, but I don't want to give it to a child because they can't understand it. I'm trying to reach out, a businessman goes, I'm trying to reach out to people. They don't understand this. Is there a new translation? I don't want to use that New Revised. Is there another translation out there? And so ironically enough, the birthplace of the New International Version, this is a little trivia knowledge, Palos Heights, Illinois. Trinity Christian College is where the Bible Committee on Bible Translation first convened into 1965 to start the New International Version. So one of the interesting things is living in Chicago, a lot of these translations emerged from Chicago. We are like the breadbasket of Bible translations. Again, some people still love the King James, so that the New King James emerges in the 1970s. There's some revisions there. So you have kind of in that side of all these new translations going back to the original texts and trying to bring them into modern English in different ways. You might say, what's the difference between them? We'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. But then what happens in the last half of the 20th century, this is what I call the New Revised Versions. So a lot of those revised versions get revised again. And that's where you start to see a kind of an even more smorgasbord of translations. So you have the Revised Version. Well, yeah, you have the New Revised Version. It's a kind of an updating. And so a lot of these are an updating of that. And that actually just got updated again in 2022. Another updated version of the New Revised Version, updated version edition. And that was tied to some biblical scholars doing that. You have the Message, which is another paraphrase. The difference between the Message and the Living Bible is the Message, Eugene Peterson went to the original languages as he translated it. But he would say this is a paraphrase. This is me trying to this isn't a study Bible. This is a Bible to help you read and understand, to get people interested in the Bible, to hopefully help you read another Bible. But he used the original languages. The New International Version, it's a lower reading level, but they wanted to make an even easier to read Bible for those who don't speak English as their first language, for children. So they came out with the NIRV, the New International Reader's Version. And I think actually our children's curriculum at times will quote from that, and we'll use that because it's a lower reading level. So it's taking the New International and trying to even lower the reading level so kids could read it more easily, taking out big honking words so they can read that. The NASB, the New International Bible, gets an update in 1995. That's where they take out these and thous. The 1977 version still has thous. 1995 does not. And then they just came out with an update in 2020. Called the New American Standard Bible 2020 update. And some people weren't huge fans of that update, so they came out with another update of the New American Standard Bible called the Legacy Standard Bible in 2021. So if we'd had this 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there'd be a bunch of Bible translations we wouldn't touch on yet. They keep on coming out, but a lot of these are revisions of the revisions. The New Living Translation, that's a new translation, 1996. Some of my professors worked on that. They've been updating, doing some revisions there since then. But that was initially going to be a revision of the Living Bible, but they actually went back to the original languages. So it's another true translation. The Holman Christian Standard Bible, that is, who's Holman and why is this the Standard Bible? Holman's a publishing house. Broadman and Holman is the Southern Baptist publishing house. So the Holman Christian Standard that's the publishing house of the Southern Baptist wing that wanted their own Bible translation. And they came out with one in 1999, 2004. They revised it, but they just revised it again, and it was such a thorough revision, that's how we got the Christian Standard Bible that we're using now. So that was revised as a thorough update, kind of taking a different technique. The ESV, the English Standard Version, comes out in 2001. That's actually going back to the RSV, It's an update and revision of that. That one that actually people had some misgivings about, they said, let's revise that a little bit in line with things. So that's a revision. There's another one, that the New English Translation, the NET. This is very, if you notice NET, 2001, what's going on in 2000s, internet's being born, already out there. Their first version, they don't call it version 1.0, it's the beta version, like an online technology. And then version 2.0, and they have version 2.1. Kind of like that, because it's being done in the internet age, putting all these translations up there. There was an update of the NIV in 2002 called Today's New International Version. And that made a few shifts and changes. And then they updated the NIV again in 2011. So that's the kind of, if you buy an NIV now, that's what it looks like. And then, once again, the New American Bible got a revision in 2011. One of my professors at Loyola worked on that, so I felt I have obligation and honor to him to recognize they did a translation revision. But again, you notice all these revisions kind of updating these things. So I went through a lot of different translations there, and we can come back to some of the differences there, but kind of the eras you have, it's illegal to do it. It's okay to do it, but now you have a bunch of smattering. Now it's approved to do it, this one translation, but then let's update this thing, and now let's update the updates. But you see a plethora of different translations. Part of the reason going on here, too, is all of these Bibles are published by different companies to a certain degree. Different teams are working on these things. And the fact that we have so many of these things right here, this is definitely a first world problem. If we were in another country, we would not have all this many translations. So again, if you're like, I don't know where this, like, why do we have so many, like, we're gifted. Because I'll say in a moment, like, if you're like, I don't understand this one, jump to another one. In your other parts of the world, you don't understand it, that's all you got. But let me pause for questions on kind of the backdrop, the narrative of translations before talking about some of the differences between them.
When did the medieval Catholic Church quit using the Vulgate Bible? When did they discontinue that?
If my understanding is correct, it's really not until that Vatican II era of the 1960s where you get everything moving away from the Latin Mass, and that's when you have the New American Bible coming. So like there's a Catholic Bible translation in the 1600s or in the 1500s, but they were translating from the Vulgate, so they were still using that as their main text. But then it's kind of broadening them. Yeah, I mean, there's an element, and actually the Vulgate's also using some older, like less, I mentioned how the King James is only using a few manuscripts. Well, the Vulgate would be even older than that, so they're only using a few manuscripts, so you have a few spots where you're like, oh, maybe that's not the best way to understand that now that we have more data. So, but now there are English Bible translations in the Catholic tradition from the original languages. So, Jay?
I know this is going to come up, but the King James Version, I used to go to a church, King James only. What is the rationale behind the King James Version as being the only version?
Yeah, I think some of the rationale people sometimes have is because it was this idea that the Bible shouldn't be changed. So this idea of all these new translations must be. I actually don't like the term versions on these things because it makes it sound like these are different versions. Like you're including things that other people aren't including. These are different translations. And if you look actually the background of the King James Version, they're saying we're trying to make something for our time and place. So they're almost assuming there's going to be more translations. But I think partly is some of these translations got tied up into some people deviating from the Christian faith. And so this idea that if you get away from that King James Version, you're going to lose the faith. So I think that's kind of the motivation at times behind it, or that these fancy scholars are messing with things or changing things. So I think that's some of the elements, but not recognizing, the King James, there's elements with it. It's older. It's not using some of the best manuscripts. So I think there's reasons not to use it. But I do think it's maybe a little bit of a fear in that, God's going to preserve his word. So the translation, almost this view that translation was inspired, but it wasn't. It's not the translation that people are working on these things. So. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about some of the nature of translation, then we'll kind of apply it to a few of these different translations. I want to give a few quick big picture ideas. These are general principles of translation, not just of Bible translations. If you've ever learned a foreign language, you know this. No two languages are alike. There's no one-to-one correspondence, that there's differences in every language and how they're structured and how in the order. Even I've learned German, I've learned French, I've learned Greek, I've learned Hebrew. There's similarities between Greek and German. These things are similar, but it's not universal. And even this idea that there's always idioms that don't translate one language to another. When a professor of mine, he was from Italy, and he shared one time, he's like, that statement is really up the wall. And I was like, oh, you mean off the wall? But I think the way it was being rendered, the way he rendered it was up the wall. So like these little things, languages don't translate one to one. And also, no single language stays the same. Again, translate this into the vulgar language of the time. I don't think anyone here wants to say, hey, how do you guys, what kind of Bible translation do you use? Oh, we use a vulgar translation. I don't think that word's changed over time. Other words change, and even within one country and one time, you have different viewpoints on language. Can you end a sentence with a preposition? Some would say, no, you can't. That's improper English. Others would say, what in the world are you talking about? Like there's different viewpoints. Should you use the passive voice? I am doing this, or I like to use these is words. Some people say that's improper. Someone say, no, that's how you should write. Like there's different ways, even in our language, of how do you refer to one person who's a generic person? Do you man? Do you use they? There's all these sorts of things that you can't. Languages are changing. Even other languages, like a lot of languages have gender on words. We don't have that in English. In Hebrew, there's this thing of dual, where it's like a dual case. It's like, that's not what we have in English. So no two languages are the same, and no single language stays steady over time. Sometimes then people say, well, what's the goal of the translation? I got this from someone that's involved in translation. Ultimately, the goal in translation in the world, if you are trying to translate something in law, in culture, is to have a faithful, accurate, and complete translation. So you're like, I want a literal translation. No, the goal isn't literal per se. The goal is to be faithful to what's being said, accurate to being said, and complete. Nothing's left out, nothing's misconstrued, and it's faithful to what's being said. That's what a translator is doing. So that's the nature of translations. That's why we need to do it. But that's just kind of some good things to keep in mind as we talk through it. So now we'll jump into, okay, so why are there these different translations? What leads to some of the differences here, and then talk about some of the nuances. So the specific choices, if you're like, you're going to make a Bible translation. Okay, you've been commissioned to make a Bible translation. What sort of questions would you need to answer? Well, the first one you could say is, am I seeking to make a complete update or just a refresh? As I said, some Bible translations are seeking to update what's there. So they're saying, basically, unless there's something wrong with this old translation, let's keep it the same. Unless it's unclear, we're just kind of updating it. Others say, no, we want a whole refresh. We want to go all the way back and start from scratch. Don't think of anything before, we're creating something new. We're going back. Those are different purposes. One is truly updating, saying we want to keep it the same, but where it's confusing because times have changed, let's change it. That's a different method. That's an easier method than going all the way back. But some Bible translations say, let's start from the beginning, which means they might not retain traditional language, because they're not trying to do that, whereas others saying we're trying to retain that, so you still memorize it the same way, but we'll just make sure it's less confusing. So that's, why is this being done? I'd say, yeah, that's kind of the first question. The second question in these translations is, so who? Twofold. Who are you doing this for? Are you trying to translate for a non-native English speaker? Are you trying to translate for someone who's got a college degree? You trying to translate it for a child, for kind of the average person? Who's your audience? What level? What's their reading level? What's their understanding? How do they speak? If you're like, I just want an everyday thing, then you might want to say, we're going to translate it a little more in everyday speech. It's okay if it doesn't follow proper grammar, because we don't want proper grammar, because that's not how people speak. Or if you're like, no, we want it to be in like proper English, that's how people, then you're going to do it differently. But also, who's the audience and who's doing it? Are you just going to have a bunch of people from one tradition? A bunch of Lutherans, a bunch of Catholics, a bunch of Reformed people? Or are you going to say, hey, we want to get a wide variety of people involved to have a team that comes so we don't get anyone getting their ideas in there? Is it going to be a big team? Is it going to be a small team? What's their credentials? And that's what differs sometimes. Some of the teams are smaller, some are bigger, some are multi-denominational, some are we only want people that believe that the Bible is God's inerrant, infallible word. And that's the only people we want on this. We want to keep that conviction. Others, like the New Revised Standard, will say, no, we want people of a variety of backgrounds that may or may not be believers in that sense, but are Bible scholars. Like, who do you want working on this? So that's the reason, that's how we get some differences. You get different people working on it. Although what is interesting is some of the same people work on some of these different translations, which goes to show maybe it's not like us versus them. It's like we're just trying to do this for different people, for different purposes. What's the starting point? And this could get, I'll try to do this as simplistic as possible. What's the starting text? And this is where actually you get the King James, the New King James differ from basically every other translation. So the reason we have to ask this question, to look at this question is, we don't have the original manuscripts. We don't have what the apostles wrote. We have copies of copies. And because of that, when you're making copies, and you don't have a copier, errors creep in, right? You get errors on those. And interestingly enough, even I just wanted to, for a brief moment of humor, look at a few typos that actually have happened in the printing age, in the printing of Bibles. So in 1631, there was what's called the Wicked Bible, because it printed and said, "Thou shalt commit adultery." The printer left out the "not." That happened in in printing presses. There's the Unrighteous Bible, 1653, where it says, "The unrighteous shall inherit the earth." Simple mistake. You can see, you gloss over a word. There was a typo. It said Jesus said that the printers have persecuted me. To be the princes, but it says maybe the printers want to get their name in there. I don't know. There's the parable of the vinegar instead of the vineyard. I mean, this is before autocorrect on text messaging. And then there's a typo in the Bible in 1795 says, "Let the children be killed first." It's supposed to be filled first, but that K and the F got messed up. Okay, so whenever you're making copies, you skip over a line, you misinterpret a word. People are doing that and copying the Bible. That's why you have all these manuscripts. And the majority of times you see differences. There's stuff like this. Like, oh, wait a minute, you forgot the "not." It's a big deal, but I can see just glossed over that, or you skipped a line. And so because of there's a bunch of manuscripts. What the King James and the New King James and occasionally another translation will kind of say is, okay, we got all these manuscripts out there. How do we decide what the original reading would be? Because there's a slight difference here. Okay, we don't have the original. Some would say majority rules. Whatever the majority of manuscript says, that's what we should go with. And that more or less is where the King James kind of lands based on some earlier era. Now, the majority can be right. The majority can also be wrong. Or you can you make one bad copy, and you make a copy of that bad copy of that. Like you can see how a majority isn't always the case. Whereas most other translations will say, let's go back, look at all of them, and say, what reading is most likely to have been original that maybe could explain the other ones? Like, oh, I could see that being left out. Oh, that was more difficult. That could be confusing. And often going back to the oldest manuscripts. Majority of Bibles are using the exact same starting point. The differences might be the King James, the New King James, and a few others that would say, no, let's use a different starting point where this is what the majority says, even though others would say, and that might be what the majority say, but the oldest and the one that seems like to make the most sense that leads to these other ones is different. But that's kind of, I'm trying to simplify this whole idea of textual criticism. There are slightly different elements, and that's actually one of the reasons I'm not a huge proponent of the King James or New King James. I think they're using a text that maybe is less likely to be original than what all the other translations are using. But again, very few passages affected, but this is why you occasionally see in a Bible a missing verse, is because it was in some of these other, it was in what the King James was using in the majority, but they realized, oh, this passage, what seemed to happen is that writer, the guy copying it, maybe he was copying Mark and he then kept on going and he was thinking of Matthew and put the wrong verse in. stuff like that, where it's like, oh, they have this element. So again, if you're making the translation, what you're going to use. But then the biggest thing is the how, and this is where we get some of these different methods of thought. And there's kind of three major schools of thought. There's what's called the literal, or another way is formal equivalence. And what this is, people often call this word for word. Now, technically, you can't totally do this, because Greek has no word order. Like, it doesn't matter what order it is. In English, we have to have a certain word order. So it's never word for word. There's always moving things around to make it English. But some people say, I want every word to be basically rendered by one word, a word for word translation. Everything to be its equivalent. And this is where, like, a New American Standard Bible, that's where they're big proponents of. King James kind of falls in this to a large degree. English Standard Version as well. But trying to say, we want to make sure we're not adding anything or removing anything, but we want a word for word. Now, the challenge with that is sometimes one word in Greek might need to be 2 or 3 words in English. Or 3 words in Greek might be best rendered in 1 word in English. Or the word order, word for word, the structure doesn't always fit. So, but that's one idea, saying we want a word for word. We want to try to keep it as close to the original as possible. We want to make it sound as Greek-like, but still be okay English. That's what that school thought. The other kind of side of things was called what they'd say a dynamic. They say we want it to function equivalently. So not word for word, but more idea of thought for thought. That we want what this is being said, we want to convey that into English. You might need 5 words. You might need 1 word. You might need to kind of move things around. You might need to reformulate the sentence. It's not the word order. It's how would you convey this in English? So they're kind of favoring saying, what does it mean, but how do I say this in today's language? Whereas the other one's saying, how do we basically make today's language reflect what it says? So it's either word for word, thought for thought. And so you'll see like the NIV gets a little bit more into that side of things. You'll see the continuum down there. That the New Living does that as well. There's others that try to say, can we kind of split the difference? And that's what we call this optimal equivalence. They call it literal and readable. And this is really where the CSB tries to land in there, and others would say they're trying to be in there as well. The other idea is a paraphrase, which is not a translation proper. Paraphrase, you're going to add a lot of words. You're trying to kind of put it in your own words. That's I kind of exclude those as translations. So you might say, okay, that sounds a bunch of theory. Let's get some nuts and bolts here. Okay, so let's think through. Okay, Matthew 20 says, this is the parable of, not of the vinegar. No, not the parable of the vinegar. This is a parable of the workers in the vineyard, where Jesus tells the story of the owner goes out, hires these people for a day's wage, and then a few hours later hires other people out and ends up giving them a day's wage and all this. Well, it says in the Greek that he hires them for a denarius. And obviously we all, I use denarius every day in my life. That's common everyday language, right? That's part of the vulgar language of our time. Okay, how do you translate that? Well, if you want to be word for word, you would use the word denarius, okay, right? And that's what some translations will do. But does that make sense to us? Do we know? I mean, we might know what that means, but you have to learn. You have to be educated. What's a denarius? That's a day's wage. So do you render it, hey, this is what the word says, or do you say he hired them for a day's wage? Or do you, it's tough with inflation to know what a day's wage exactly is, but do you put the amount in there? Like word for word, thought for thought, like that. How do you translate that? When Noah is being told to build the ark, and it's this many cubits by this many cubits. Oh, I can visualize. What's a cubit? Right? There's even debates about what a cubit is. Do you put cubits? Do you put the equivalent in feet measurements? There's like literal versus thought. Like, how are you trying to convey that? If you're saying I want to stick as close to, you need to put cubits in that, or to kind of get a little racy here. Okay, Genesis 4:1 literally says Adam knew Eve and they had a son. How do you render that? You say, well, literally it says knew, but when he knew her, like that's. But how do you render that in a age appropriate, PG way? Or do you use euphemisms? Do you need to translate that? And so like other translations will say Adam was intimate with his wife, made love. Some of them get even a little more graphic than that. It's like, are you trying to convey the word? The word's literally new, but if you, I knew that we don't use know that way. At least I don't. Maybe we do. I don't know. I don't commonly use that. Like there's idioms. Gird up your minds. Gird up the loins of your mind. What is that? That's an idiom. Do you literally render that, or do you need to say, be prepared and be ready? Like that's where these things kind of go. Are you trying to make it readable or kind of faithful on that? So there's all, that's where these differences. So if you have the handout there again online, you hopefully can be able to find that in the comments there. You can see kind of the continuum that you have some that are on the more word for word, which can be, it's in English, but it's not always as clear English. Like the New American Standard Bible, that is as word for word as you can really be without becoming interlinear. So you can really get a window into that, but it's not always clear. Dennert and all these things. Whereas others on the other side, like the New Living, will be on the kind of really thought for thought. So it won't use denarius. So we'll say a day's wage. King James says for a penny. Interestingly enough, so they weren't word for word, and they used a term that like he hired them for a penny. Like what? I mean, I understand times have changed, but does that convey the best language? But yeah, NASB is more word for word. New Living is more thought for thought, and kind of moving the word order around. Whereas a lot of other ones are in between. The King James, New King James, try to be more word for word. Christian Standard tries to be a little more of that in between, thought for thought. So you see kind of a continuum on that of how they're making those decisions based on their audience. Who is this for? Or if you're saying, hey, we have a word for word translation, we don't need another one, but we need something different that people are going to read. So I'll pause there for questions, clarifications on kind of the background of what they're deciding, or if you want to kind of dig deeper in any of the particular translations about what decisions they're making and why there's that difference. Well, I'll jump down and kind of give some details on a few translations, and then we'll kind of think through a few closing questions. So I call this the nuances. So I just kind of looked at doing some quick evaluation, and I found that the top 5 sold Bibles last year, the Bibles that sold the most, number 1 was the NIV, number 2 was the ESV, number 3 was the NLT, number 4 was the CSB, and number 5 was the King James. Now, if you actually look at the percentage of people reading Bibles, the King James is still the most read Bible, about 55%, because they're not always buying new ones, but they have them out there. But those are the top 5 selling Bibles, just for what it's worth. NIV is the most popular, but it's readable, but it can be kind of inconsistent at times. So interestingly enough, it wants to kind of be a little more in today's language, but it renders that denarius as a denarius, which requires you to look up and say, what does that mean? So they're kind of inconsistent. They're not always clear. At times, they're a little more interpretive. You can get this option. They might kind of take a stance as opposed to leaving it open-ended. But again, that's a few thoughts on that. The ESV is faithful to the original, but it's not always easy to read in English. Part of the ESV is trying to almost be like in proper English, a little bit like King James English at times, or just being proper English, which I've noticed not everyone writes that way or talks that way, and so it can be difficult to understand, or the word order can still be more reflective of formal talk as opposed to everyday talk. So that's kind of a challenge with that. The New Living, I'd say this, it's readable, but at times it may leave out some nuances because they're trying to express things. And at times I've read that and missed a connection here and there because they're trying to convey the words and thoughts. And sometimes you lose some of that familiar language. It's unfamiliar. It's not. You try to quote it and it sounds a little different. But it's readable, but it might leave out those nuances. What I've liked about the CSB is I feel like it's more readable than the ESV. It loses less nuances than the NIV and the NLT, but it's also still new. I'm still exploring and learning some things. There's not as many resources out there for it because it's still new coming out. Some things take time to really ingrate themselves in. The King James is classic. Obviously, a lot of us have, quoting the Lord's Prayer, quoting Psalm 23, you might be quoting things. And I said to you, it's okay. You quote the Bible in whatever translation you remembered it. Like, it doesn't make a difference. But it might be outdated in English. Sometimes you really are like, I don't even know what that means. Or again, the manuscript tradition, it's not up to date in what's using the best knowledge of today. So those are the most popular ones, and kind of the pros and cons of each of those. I want to kind of point out a few other translations I think have some interesting nuances. Again, the NASB 1995 is the most literal word for word, which is a weakness and a strength. The newer edition, it seems to have lost some of that, to be honest. When I've looked at it, it doesn't seem to quite have the same feel, but it often can be awkward English. So that's still like, when I tell students, if you're learning the language, you want to go back and see it, use that NASB 1995 edition. It's still being printed, it's still available. To be honest, probably my favorite translation of all time was this Net Bible. Net Bible it's supposed to be the Bible who explains itself, and that's why I like it. Basically, every Bible has a few footnotes in it to explain, like it says literally or translator's notes. The Net takes that to another level. There is 60,000 footnotes of translations. I find that really cool. I also find that a little overwhelming and think that could be I remember using them like, it's got this giant, like, it has so many notes, it can be so big, or there's so much footnoting, but they're constantly trying to update. So they try to translate and then explain what's going on. This is what it says, but this is what it says, but literally it says this. So you can see it all and see what they're doing. So I like it. It's available on the internet because it's the Net Bible, but it can be a little overwhelming. The Amplified Bible, I know some people really like the Amplified Bible, and if you don't know the Amplified Bible, what we'll do is it will like give all sorts of options. Like it could be this, which is cool to know the options, but you need to always remember language doesn't work with like all of the above. Language means one thing. So you almost have to pick one. Like they're trying to give all the options, which is helpful, but it doesn't mean all those things. It means one thing. And so it kind of can have this kind of nuance there. And again, the New Revised Standard Version, that is the most common used among biblical scholars. Or if you have someone that's going to like a college, they're taking like a Bible as literature class, that's probably the translation they would be using in those classes. It's one that is kind of most widespread, whereas like the NIV or the ESV is often used by church-going Christians, people who believe Bible is God's word and authority. The New Revised is going to be kind of used more widespread. So like when I was writing or using things for a broader audience, that would usually be the Bible I would quote to try to be let's be on common ground. It's what's going out there. So just to know that. So you might see those, or sometimes when you see the Bible quoted in general public, they might be quoting from that because that's the kind of widespread one. It's not a bad translation. It's just that's part of it. I do just want to give a couple notes about translations that are a little problematic. The New World Translation, do not use. I always say use the Bible translation that you make sense, but don't use that one. I say that because it's Jehovah's Witness. I talked about this a little bit last deep dive. They kind of bring their theology into it, and so there's some things they change, or they don't render anything that kind of smacks of Jesus being God can be changed or altered. Not all the time, but it's bringing theology into it. And then there is another translation kind of circulating out there that I've heard some people have asked me about called the Passion Translation, the TPT. You'll see this. It was at Bible Gateway for a time. It's on the Bible app on YouVersion. I'm not a fan of it. I don't think it's a translation. I think it's a paraphrase. Yes, he's gone back to the original languages. I think the guy has a good heart, but he seems to be adding some things into it. And he tries to put them in italics so you can kind of tell. But it's also, I've noticed everyone working on the kind of checking his work all seems to have a certain theological background. Kind of a very kind of Pentecostal charismatic. So they're kind of bringing their theology in. He's like, I'm trying to convey the full meaning, but it's amazing how many times I look that up and it seems to kind of be adding his theological bent into it. So it's now a wide team. And so I would say it's a paraphrase masquerading as a translation. That being said, paraphrases, Message, Living Bible. Paraphrases aren't bad to use. Just know that it's not a study tool. It's a reading tool. Like you use those to jump back. Sometimes it's helpful to get a new way of rendering it, but a paraphrase is not a true translation. They're not trying to convey the original. They're trying to kind of make you think. kind of strike you anew, but it's not a translation. It's someone kind of intentionally trying to put it in different, fresh language. So paraphrases are good, but they're not translations. So I've gone through a wide gamut of translations on background, so I do want to give space to ask questions for if you want to know particular things about particular translations, nuances, things that I've covered or haven't covered. So I want to open up for more questions. Covered it decently, or
before there's been some extended time of checking the validity and
yeah, so that's a good question. So maybe three elements, or I'll start with two and see if I add a third. So one is, so it came out in 2017, and there was an update revision in 2020, like you saw with a lot of these. So it's already kind of had that, and even there, it was initially going to be an updating and revision of the Holman Christian Standard Bible, and they kind of went to the next. So that had a few different renditions through, and that the team that worked on it, they had a great interdenominational team working on the initial HCSB, and then they have a good team working on the CSB. So it's not like one person went and made some changes, and now they're kind of checking as they go. They've checked it, but now they're kind of like, oh, maybe this makes more sense. So it's very similar to what's happened. And usually what ends up happening at some point, I mean, I was using the ESV on stuff, even there was updates I noticed. Occasionally you'd see a little slight update in like the ESV that we were using back in 2016 that was different than the Bible I had printed and was using. So that's fairly common, and it's usually minor nuances, not like, oh, that verse is totally different now. And I'd say too, like in our day and age, so much is electronic, so much is projected on screens. You know, we can easily change back pretty easily. We never said everyone go out and buy this new Bible. It's like, hey, I'm going to use this. That's what we're going to use. But if we come across something that's weird, but I've yet to find that weirdness. But I think that is a good element. Like, sometimes there is a good thing to, like, something comes out, you let it wait a little bit. And actually, I saw that with some movements people were making in translation work 15 years ago that people were really skeptical about. Over time, people are like, oh, wait a minute, actually, it's not as big of a deal as we thought. Like, sometimes there's outrage, and then it cools off, and you just kind of wait time, and then it works a little bit better. Well, let me use a few more minutes to make a couple of final comments, and then we can feel free to ask me questions even as we go moving forward. Bottom line, okay, so there's all these different translations. What should I use? What's the best one? I've kind of given my thoughts on that a little bit, the one you'll read. But here's kind of some guidance. If you're like, I want to get a Bible, I want to recommend a Bible to someone, here's the questions I think it's good to think through. Who's the Bible for? Who's going to use your Bible? Is it, child? Is it college educated? Is it someone who's read the Bible before? Someone who's never read the Bible at all? Like, who is the audience? What do they usually read? How do they speak? They kind of think through who. That's the most important. Like, who is this for? It might not be a one size fits all. It doesn't have to be King James and be like, well, this is the only Bible out there. Like, yeah, we might read something in church, but that doesn't have to be the Bible you read. So for a while, they were in the churches would have the bishop's Bible, but they might read the Geneva Bible. So who is this for? Who are you giving this to? What's going to be their use? If you're like, I just want a Bible that I want to just be able to read in the morning, just kind of like to reflect a little bit. I'm not, digging deep in. I'm not teaching lessons. I'm not, that might lead to a different question than if you're like, I really want to study this. I'm moving into teaching. I'm going to be guiding people. You might say, I want something more literal because I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Where if you're like, I just want to read it, and I want a Bible I'm going to easily pick up and be easy to understand in the morning, right when I'm having my coffee. Well, maybe you want easy to read. Maybe you want the New Living or something easy reading because it's like you're still waking up and it's there. Like, when are you using it? What are you using it for? And then also even like, what particular needs does this person have? And that can indicate, like, do you want to give them a study Bible? Do you want to give them a large print Bible? Do you want to think through the person? And goes back to, this is a first world problem. We got all these different types out there. So think through, okay, who is this for? The beauty is there's so many out there that we really have no excuse saying, I can't find one. It's saying which is the right one, but to say, like, if this isn't working, I can go with this one. I can reach different elements. I was actually looking, one translation's less commonly known, started out kind of being used in the deaf community a little bit more, kind of had some connections with that. So it's like working with different groups, different people. And so you have a lot of different elements. And yeah, the other kind of backdrop too is a lot of these different Bible translations, again, are published by different publishers. So you have different publishing houses throughout the country. That's partly why you have them as well. Again, a lot of them are in, like, the ESV, the NLT, both publishing houses are in Chicagoland. The NIV started in Chicago. It's kind of a funny Chicago connection with a lot of these things. But yeah, to think of the needs, the format, that's, again, what's the Bible? It's going to help you read and enter more into God's Word. So that's kind of the bottom line takeaway is now we understand a little bit more of why there's differences, and hopefully that why doesn't say that Bible's bad, that Bible's wrong. It's saying, oh, that Bible's serving that purpose. This Bible's serving this purpose. How can I match purposes or even just styles with different personalities, both my own but also others to think through. So again, for one more chance for any final questions before I close in prayer. Mark.
So what do you think the standard translation is used when they translate into different languages? So which translation is being used?
Yeah, I mean, the best translations being used are, going back to just as the English translations weren't using Luther's German and moving it into English, it's going back to the original languages and then bringing those into using the original languages and then bringing that into the native languages being translated now. So that's. So they would use the original language and bring it into the native language? Yeah, because otherwise you might be bringing nuances in. It's like making a copy of a copy sometimes where it gets a little fuzzier. If you truly want to be as true to the original, you go back to the original and say, that's what translation is, saying, this is what this language says, how do I say it in this language? And you have to know both languages to do so. And sometimes you have to kind of lean one way or the other, but you have to know them both. And even some of the movements of updating Bible translations sometimes are tied to either or of, we have a better understanding of the source language. Because there are some Hebrew terms in the King James, they didn't really know what they meant at times, and now there's more knowledge of those things. So we better understand the source, or we better understand or updating the receptor, kind of what's being received. Oh, that's not how language works now, or this language has changed. Obviously, the source never changes itself, but our understanding of the source can change. Well, I'll go ahead and close this in prayer. Thanks for your time and attention. Father God, we do once again give you thanks for the ability to read your word. Help us to better understand this. Help us to dig more deeply into your truth. And again, we give you thanks for all these people that have worked on all these different translations. They have brought your truth to others, and the way that you use the variety out there to meet a variety of needs in our world. So help us be focused on what's true and on the message being contained, not on the different ways that it's being brought to people, and continue to help us to best convey your truth into our lives and our world today. And may we be translators of your truth as the way we live it out in action. So help us understand your word in our language and help us live your word in our lives each and every day. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen.